your point, Phil, if you make a decision on part-time to full-time subjectively, that's where you open yourself up to liability. Okay?
You could also do a multiple interview process where they come back multiple times to interviews with people, different perception. At the same time, the way you ask certain questions, a lot of them do the way they're talking, and they can take themselves without having to do the testing.
Great point. In other words, process. And I think where you're going, so your name is
Keith.
Keith, where Keith is going is the process subjective or objective? What are you gleaning from that? In other words, if you do multiple interviews, are they subjective or objective? In other words, are they measuring something that I can use to make the decision and defend it? Okay, and so what we're going to talk about is defensibility. The uniform guidelines on employee selection is what drives the whole question that Phil asked me a year ago. And what I mean by that is, I showed you the 6 laws that pretty much dominate your hiring process and your continued employment process for your folks. The uniform guidelines on employee selection are an EEOC guideline, not a federal law. Let me make that distinction. There is no federal law that says, here are the uniform guidelines for hiring. But the EEOC, okay, when they put a guideline in place, this is what they tell their inspectors to look for, their auditors to look for, in terms of process and the way that you manage your process. Okay, and so this is by de facto law. Okay, because the EEOC uses this as their blueprint in which they're going to make decisions whether or not they're going to pursue any sort of action against you or any sort of continued or expanded audit against you. Does that make sense? And please stop me with questions if I'm not being clear. So I can make a decision not to hire. Ma'am, your name is Nana. Nana comes to work for me today. She wants to work at Greg Lawton Ambulance Service. Okay? I can make a decision whether or not to hire Nana based on uniform guidelines for employee selection. Okay? That's the best way to make a decision on whether or not Nana comes to work or not. Any decision I make has to be used on a process, in my opinion, this is a Greg opinion, that has already been through the courts. So in other words, let's not make up our own process. Let's use one that has already been given some sort of evidence by the courts. And I can adversely impact Nana's employment if I have a justified reason that is job specific. Questions on that? I'll give you more detail. In other words, if I can justify that Nana has, for some reason, something about the job that I have measured, qualified, quantified, and is objective that Nana cannot do, back to your point on the physical agility test, is one way to do that, then I can, based on these uniform guidelines, discriminate. Key word there. And there's a difference between adverse impact and discrimination, but I can literally say a person cannot work here based on a certain job-specific criteria. So we have to measure that, and we have to identify that. And so outlines of the uniform guidelines include, we have to establish validity to protect ourselves. Okay, in other words, we have to validate the decision we're making is based on some objective data that is relative to the job. Okay? And I'll get deeper into that in a second. It's usually done through job analysis, and that's what's recommended in the EEOC guidelines, is that some level of job analysis is done, and we're proving something that actually predicts that if I'm hired for this job, I'm highly likely not to succeed because the data doesn't support it. It's objective, meaningful, and I can differentiate between people. And ma'am, your name was?
My name?
Yes, ma'am.
Audrey.
Audrey. As Audrey mentioned earlier, if I start to not hire somebody based on a particular reason, I need to have a good reason. I can't just not hire somebody full time, or I can't just make a decision. I've got to have facts. And then lastly, second to last, use of a selection procedure. Your procedures, if you want to remain on this side of the law or the guidelines, your procedures must be consistent. They can't vary. We work with folks in lots of different parts of the country, and one of the first thing we find, and I just had a conversation with a client this week. The client said, between you and me, I love when a conversation starts out this way, between you and me, our processes haven't quite been consistent in all of our locations when we've been hiring. And I usually understand that this is an ambulance client, and in our industry, and I was in the industry for 35 years as a manager, so I get it. Oftentimes, we rely on hiring managers, not ourselves as owners, our senior managers. We rely on hiring managers to make hiring decisions for us. And we assume, in our industry, that those decisions are being made consistently and appropriately and within the uniform guidelines. Okay? Nothing I'm telling you today is probably an epiphany. And so, at this point, are they using selection procedures that I can defend as an owner? And that's the only point I'm trying to make here. And then lastly, how do you document those things? I see a lot of clients who actually have pretty good procedures in place, but they don't do a great job of making sure that that information is discoverable, and they can't protect themselves. And so you really want a good process for documentation in place when you're making these decisions. Questions so far? Or comments? Or arguments? So what can you do? It becomes the big question. What can you do as an employer? And Audrey, again, you hit the nail on the head. Is there a test? Is there a process? Is there something you can do? Nana comes to work and she wants to come to work, but is she the right person to put into our organization? Phil says to me, I got this data, I got good data. There's a certain kind of person that if we don't hire, our healthcare costs are going to go down. Okay? But we can't, as we know, we can't just discriminate. We can't just make something up and say, this is not a good person for us because it's a 55-year-old Irish white guy. You can't not hire for that, okay, as you know, okay? Being a 55-year-old Irish white guy, I would be offended. So we have to, you didn't know I was 55, did you, Phil? I've stunned you. But we can focus on ability, behavior, and history, okay? And going back to the uniform guidelines, as long as we have a procedure in place to manage that. So let's be more specific. Is there something about people that we can glean from their history, that we can glean from their behavior, and glean from their ability? Of course. So if we use that kind of process, we need to make sure that it's done the same way for everybody each time, and that it's objective. Make sense so far? And the objective piece is the critical piece there, because once you start looking at the ability, the behavior, and the history, now you get what's called a predictable risk management and future success determination in terms of, can I move forward with that person? I can do something that's objective and actually start to make a decision. Is this the right person for me?